Hey, Adventure Clubbers, I'm glad to see you guys again today. We are in the book of Luke, and I told you last week that we were finishing up the beginning part of the big God story, which we call the Old Testament or the Old Covenant or Promise, and we are moving today into the New Covenant, the New Testament. And the New Testament begins with Jesus, the fulfillment of God's promise to his people. So Luke is the story of Jesus Christ exactly as it happened. And it's written, the author is Luke, and he was a physician or a doctor. So the way Luke tells the story of Jesus, there are actually 4 books in the New Testament that tell the life of Jesus, and we call those the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Well, the way Luke writes the story is different than the other Gospels. Like I told you, Luke was a doctor, and so he told the story of Jesus in great detail, kind of like a doctor would, give you all the background, and even calls some of the healings that Jesus did, he calls them by their medical name. So that's one of the ways we know that Luke is the author of this book, that it is titled by. So the writer, Luke, tells the story historically and in great detail, and so it's the longest of the 4 Gospels. It's actually the longest book in all of the New Testament. He was not Jewish. The author was not Jewish. He was probably Greek, and he wrote the Gospel for mainly non-Jewish people. We call those Gentiles, and his goal was to prove that Jesus is the Son of God. So, and Luke states that right away. He says that this book is meant to give believers an accurate and careful and chronological, that means it goes in time order, understanding of Jesus's life, his ministry, his death, and his resurrection. So Luke began investigating the life of Jesus by talking to eyewitnesses, and those are some of the things that he records. And he was writing it to a guy called Theophilus, and he was giving us a thorough record of exactly what Jesus said and did. He would have been trained as a doctor to be a careful observer of things, and so that would have been a real skill that he used in writing this book. Luke's interest in people is something that I want us to think about today. The people that he calls out in this book, the interactions that Jesus has with people. Many of the people that Luke writes about that maybe aren't mentioned in some of the other Gospels are people who are a little bit on the outside, people who were sick or who were not in the social class of being totally accepted, people who had done things that were really wrong, or people who had been rejected by society. Jesus walks through the Gospel of Luke, illustrating his deep and abiding care for people, regardless of what they had done or what their status was in society. So in the Gospel of Luke, we hear Jesus say this in Luke 4:16 through 18. So Jesus went to Nazareth, his hometown, where he had been brought up. And on the Sabbath day, he went into the synagogue, that's the church, as was his custom. And he stood up to read, and out of the scroll of the prophet Isaiah, and unrolling it, he found the place where it is written. So this is Jesus reading from the Old Testament Isaiah, where we were last week. The Spirit of the Lord is on me, Jesus said, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. So this was Jesus talking. I have come to do this, he said. He said, I came to bring good news to the poor. Now the poor is different than what we think of as poor. It has a broader meaning. It's not just people who don't have a lot of money, but it can refer to people who have a lower social status, people with disabilities, or the elderly, or social outsiders. Even people whose bad choices have made them outsiders. Jesus said that God's kingdom is especially for these people. It's not just for God's chosen people, the Jewish people. Because remember, I told you, Luke wasn't a Jewish person. Jesus forgives a woman living a life of sin. He heals the sick and the blind. Probably a lot of you know the story of Zacchaeus, who was a tax collector. Jesus invites Zacchaeus into the kingdom. He tells lots of stories. One of them is a story about a father who had two sons. The younger one made a really dumb choice and wasted his inheritance, and he ran away, but then he has to come back and he's repentant. The father forgives him and throws a huge party to celebrate. Jesus tells a lot of stories, parables we call them, stories that Jesus told to make a point. Now, the book of Luke kind of ends with this. A lot of people didn't like the way Jesus taught. He didn't like that Jesus included the outcast. And so debates and arguments began to arise between Jesus and the leaders of Israel. And the story goes, Jesus went and celebrated the Passover meal. Remember, we learned about that Passover meal with his disciples. And he began to retell and reframe that Passover meal. And he took the bread and the wine and he said, these are going to be new symbols. They're not what they once were. They're not to remind you just about the release of you from slavery in Egypt, but this is a new kind of freedom that I am coming to offer. This bread is my body that will be broken for you, and this wine represents my blood, which I'm going to spill for you. After the meal, Jesus was arrested and put on trial. The Roman governor even announced that Jesus was innocent, but he gave in to pressure and they convinced him that Jesus should be crucified. So even during his painful death, the book of Luke records the way Jesus loved people. He shows the love and mercy of God to those who are crucifying him. And even the person who was being crucified next to him. Jesus dies and his body is placed in a tomb. But then on the first day of the week, we know that Jesus is alive again. Jesus raises from the dead and conquers death and brings us into relationship with him when we know him. So I love the book of Luke. I would challenge you to dig into it and know that the book of Luke is not just for you, but it's for you and you and you and for me. It's about the availability of salvation for everyone. So it's a great book for you to dig into. God's grace is all over the book of Luke. Thank you for following along so well. We're going to be in Acts next week, which is actually an extension of this book. So part 2 is coming next week. Bye, guys.